Thank you, Mr. President. Just 3.5 months ago, a sneaky, dangerous virus turned our country and the world upside down. It's hard to believe that it was just 3.5 months ago in mid-March that we were headed toward March Madness in basketball, that our economy was roaring, that unemployment rates for about every category were as low as they've been in a long, long time. America felt really good about itself. And by the time we got to the 4th of July, it would have been a terrific celebration. Then here came this dangerous, sneaky virus and turned our lives and those of countries all over the world upside down. I want to comment this afternoon on some aspects of where we are in terms of COVID-19 based upon 5 congressional hearings this month that I've either chaired or attended in our Health Committee, or the one I participated in today in Senator Blunt's Appropriations Committee on Health. Of course, Senator Murray of Washington State is the ranking Democrat on both of those committees. Of course, much of the talk was about vaccines. Even though we've appropriated $3 trillion and an astonishing another $3 trillion in credit, that's not going to really solve the problem. This disease, this virus, the only cure for it is tests, treatments, and vaccines ultimately. And it's appropriate that we talk about vaccines because our country is moving more rapidly than it ever has to produce a safe and effective vaccine for a new virus. As Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, told our subcommittee this morning, usually it takes historically 5 to 10 years to create a vaccine. And here the goal of the administration's warp speed effort to create a vaccine is to have 300 million doses ready by the first of this coming year. In other words, 6 months from now. That's their aspirational goal. They're not sure they'll get there. But you don't get anywhere if you don't set high goals. We know that as a country. So they've set an enormously ambitious goal. And we're taking steps that are like none we've ever taken before, such as Congress has appropriated money and approved starting to build a manufacturing plant for a vaccine before we know that it works. Now, we don't do that before we know that it's safe, but we do it before we know that it's worked, and we can be sure that in some cases we're going to lose that money. But it's better to cut 6 months or a year off the amount of time before the vaccine comes in order to take that financial risk. I think all of us would agree with that. But today, instead of talking about vaccines, which are next year's solution, let me talk about 2 aspects of COVID-19 that are this year's solution. In fact, this fall's solutions. One is tests, diagnostic tests, to find out whether you have the disease or not, and one is treatments, medicine that can be given to you to reduce the chances that you might be seriously ill or even die. That's appropriate in the first place because in not very many weeks, America's headed back to school and to college. In Metro Nashville, Tennessee, the public school begins August the 4th. All across the country, most colleges and schools will be back in business by Labor Day. There are 75 million students, Mr. President, who were casualties of COVID-19. They were sent home from school or college, 100,000 public schools, 35,000 private schools, 6,000 colleges in mid-March. Graduations were canceled. Sports championships, once-in-a-lifetime events, were canceled. Parents who were working, and in our country today, 2/3 of married parents with children work outside the home. Most single parents work outside the home. Suddenly, their children were home. Teachers weren't really prepared for such whole-scale remote teaching. Parents weren't prepared for homeschooling. And so ever since mid-March, students have been in limbo. So what we're looking forward to is doing whatever we can to help make sure that those 75 million students in schools and colleges can go back to school and college this fall and go back safely. That's the importance of tests and treatments. That's the first. Now there's another one. It's not a trivial one. This is a sports-hungry country. We love our sports. Everybody's got a different sport they like. And the question I asked Dr. Collins this morning was, are we going to have enough COVID-19 tests so we might watch some football this fall or some basketball this winter? Because I had read that the National Hockey League is going to test every player every day in the National Hockey League. Well, that's not recommended by the Centers for Disease Control. It's not the standard for widespread testing at schools and colleges, even though the president of Brown University told our committee she would like to test every student on their way back to Brown. But the fact of the matter is, if we're going to be able to go back to school, back to college, back to work, out to eat, maybe even watch a sports game, maybe even in some cases attend a sports game, we're going to need a lot more quick, reliable tests. Let me talk about those for just a moment in terms of going back to school and going out to eat and perhaps being able to watch a little football this fall. Admiral Giroir has testified this month before our committee that our country has done 30 million tests, more than any other country. We're doing that at about the rate of 500,000 tests a day. And he says that we'll have 4 to 5 times that many in September. Now, I hear about problems in this place or that place about people not getting a test or that it takes too long for the result to come back from the lab. But the fact of the matter is, what's going on now is every state in the country is developing a plan for July through December on how many tests Indiana, Tennessee, Alaska might need, working with the federal government, and the federal government is then supplying Tennessee with what Tennessee needs. Now, in our state, for example, which is one of the states that's in the top 10 of frequent testing, the governor has said, if you want a test, you can have a test. Go down to your public health department and you get one for free. Now, whether they'll be able to continue that, we'll see. But that's what we're doing today. But despite that, when 75 million students try to go back to school and college, I imagine principals and administrators will want to test teachers frequently, older people frequently, some classes, everybody in the class. If one student gets sick, maybe everybody in a school, an elementary school. If several students get sick, maybe parents and grandparents if the children bring home a disease. So we're going to need a lot more tests, which is why Senator Blunt and I and others worked together in the last legislation to support what we call the Shark Tank at the National Institutes of Health. Mr. President, this is an unprecedented effort at the National Institutes of Health, led by Dr. Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project and is one of the most distinguished scientists in our country. This is a project to see if we can find a new way to create tens of millions of diagnostic tests that are what they call point-of-care tests. And that means that you can take them instantly, you can get a result within an hour or so, that they're inexpensive and that they're reliable. You don't have to ship them off. Probably you get them by saliva, so you might put a lollipop in your mouth and let that saliva on the lollipop in one way or another indicate whether you have a positive or a negative result. Dr. Collins' goal, and he said this is a very aspirational goal, but his goal is to be able to produce 1 million of those tests a day by Labor Day. Now, Mr. President, this would change our lives in a large number of ways. This would mean that the Brown president could surely test every student, not just once when they came back, but more often. It would mean that many sports teams could test every player every day if that's what it required. It would mean that we'd probably have more tests than we needed. And what would that do? It would, one, help contain the disease so we would identify who has this disease so we can quarantine them and the people they've exposed instead of quarantining all of us and keeping us from going back to school, out to eat, and to work. It would contain the disease, and it would build confidence. If you know that you can if you're a worker in a plant with 500 people, and you know that 6 people have had to be tested because they were tested and were positive, you're going to worry about that. But if you know that you can get a free test today and get the result in an hour, anytime you want it, I believe you're going to have more confidence in going to work, or going to school, or going out to eat, or even playing on a football team, whether you're in college or in high school. So we're pulling for Dr. Collins' Shark Tank and his effort to produce these new way of tests. They've had an unprecedented outpouring of applications. He said most of them come from smaller companies. They're down to 26, I believe, is the number, and they're putting them through this rigorous test. His goal is 1 million new tests a day. So that's important for principals to know and teachers to know, and those who are hoping to play a little football and watch a little basketball this fall, that there might be plenty of tests, plenty of quick, reliable tests to help you contain the disease in your community and to be confident that you're in a safe place. And then what's the second thing that we could expect? We heard about treatments. As Senator Kennedy of our Senate says in his inimitable way, people aren't scared of the virus because they're afraid they might get sick. They're afraid they might die. And they might, particularly if they're in a vulnerable population or older age. There's no medicine for this virus, or at least there wasn't until recently. Now there's one, remdesivir, which the United States has bought a huge amount of, that has been shown to reduce by 32%, according to the Dr. Fauci, who testified at our hearing yesterday, reduced by 32% the amount of time it takes you to recover from COVID-19. Then, according to the experts who testified, there are other plasma medicines and steroids that have shown to be helpful. That exists today. So if you're a parent or a grandparent or a teacher or administrator worried about children going back to school, you're probably not very worried about the children catching COVID-19 because generally speaking, they haven't seemed to get sick from COVID-19 all around the world. It's been older people who do. But the children might come home and bring it to the parent or the grandparent. As I said, this is a sneaky, dangerous virus. You can give it to somebody without showing any symptoms of having it. But if you get it, there are already 2 or 3 treatments that your doctors, your hospital can prescribe to shorten the time that you recover and to reduce the chance that you might die. And Dr. Collins said that by the time we get to the fall, he expects there will be more of these treatments approved by the FDA. There are different kinds of treatments, and he didn't go into all the specifics, but one kind he mentioned was the so-called antibody cocktail. This was developed during the time of Ebola, and it was approved by the FDA, and it helped us get rid of the Ebola disease before it came to the United States and caused a lot of trouble here. But the Ebola disease, this antibody cocktail, monoclonal antibody is the longer name of it, it's not approved yet. It's not proved to be safe or effective yet. But because it was once before, there is a cautious optimism that it will be approved for COVID-19, a version of it, and that those will be ready by the fall. Now, if it does work out that this treatment is safe and effective and approved by the Food and Drug Administration, there are several companies that have these antibody cocktails, and they should be able to manufacture large numbers of them. So I guess my point, Mr. President, is we talk a lot about vaccines. We spend every day hearing about the deaths, the hospitalizations, and what's going on in this spike or that spike. But as we think about 75 million students going back to school and college, going back to work, whether we'll see some football or maybe basketball later, the 2 aspects that are immediate to determine that are tests and whether the Shark Tank will produce enough of them, and treatments, and both seem to be a good possibility of being there for us in the fall. We had a hearing last week, Mr. President, that focused on this question. How do we sustain what we've built in this pandemic? In fact, one senator lectured me a little bit and said, why are we worrying about the next pandemic? We're in the middle of this one. And my answer was, because for the last 20 years, we forgot about the last pandemic as soon as it was over. And then we got to the next pandemic and we weren't as ready as we should be. We've had 4 presidents and several Congresses have passed 9 laws to try to get us ready. And then here comes this sneaky, dangerous virus, and we find some gaps in our preparation. It's not President Trump's gap. It's not President Obama's gap. It's our gap because we didn't do some of the things we should do. And one of the things I believe each of us should do in this Senate is be willing this year, this summer, to take the lessons we've learned and sustain what we've built, not just to complete our work on this pandemic, but to be ready for the next one. For example, do we have enough manufacturing capacity for the vaccines in the United States? Well, we didn't. Now we're building it. Are we going to sustain it? Number 2, what about our stockpiles? We filled them up, and then they were depleted. The stockpile here, the stockpile in the States, hospitals, they needed money, they sold off their stocks, and so they were depleted. Are we going to, we've now built them up, but are we going to sustain that for the next pandemic, or just say, okay, we beat COVID, let's go on and worry about something else? Or what about data? We're not getting all the data we want in the way we should be getting it from the Centers for Disease Control. Are we just going to forget that, or are we going to do something about that now? Hospital preparedness. Hospitals weren't really ready. Now, they did a magnificent job of getting ready, but we lagged on hospital preparedness. We've built that up again. Are we going to sustain it? Are we going to let it drop off once more? Or our state and local public health. Almost all of our public health efforts in this country are state and local. We're not a small European country where everything's centralized. We're a great, big, complicated, diverse country where parts of Indiana are very different than parts of Tennessee and Alaska and New York or wherever we're from. And as Governor Leavitt, who testified before us, said, for 30 or 40 years, we've gradually disinvested in our public health system. We're now building that up, but are we going to sustain it? So that's my hope, Mr. President, that when it comes to building up this manufacturing capacity here in the United States, increasing our stockpiles to the levels they should be, beginning to collect the data in the way it needs to be, preparing our hospitals to receive patients, building up our state and local public health. Are we going to sustain that while we have our eye on the ball? Or are we going to do what we've done for the last 20 years and slide off into a short memory? Senator Bill Frist, who was majority leader of this body, said that he made 20 speeches in 2005 and 6 about what we needed to do to be prepared for the next pandemic, which he said is surely coming. They did some things, but most of the things that he said needed to be done weren't done. We could do them today if we would just have the resolve to do it. Governor Leavitt said that before a pandemic, those who do what he and Senator Frist did, which is to say we need to do all these things, are called alarmists. And then after a pandemic, or in the middle of it, they're called inadequate to the task. And then there's the last point I'd like to make, and it's about politics. The COVID-19 virus, this sneaky, dangerous enemy, is a science matter, not a political matter. But it has become too much of a political matter. Take the issue of masks. We got into a situation, have gotten into a situation, where whether you wear a mask depends on your attitude toward President Trump. For many Americans, it seems, if you're pro-Trump, you don't wear a mask. And if you don't like Trump, you do wear a mask. I suggested that the president might occasionally wear a mask just to signal to his followers that it's a good idea, recommended by every single health expert, to wear a mask. certainly for the protection of everybody else. Another way to say it is our athletic director at the University of Tennessee, Philip Fulmer, said, if you really, really want to watch some football, wear a mask. And what he means by that, it would help contain the disease in our area so the football players could play safely. Well, yesterday the president made it clear. He said masks are good, and he's happy to wear them when he needs to. Of course, the fact is he doesn't need to most of the time. He's tested every day. People around him are tested. And as I'm not wearing one right now, he's speaking most of the time. But there are times when I wear my mask. When I leave the floor, I wear the mask. When I go back down the hall, I wear the mask. When I'm in a smaller room, less than 6 feet away from somebody, I wear a mask. And I expect others to do that as well. We know every expert who testified in the 6 hearings I attended this month said there are 3 things to do. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and stay 6 feet apart when you can. If all of us did those things, we're much more likely to be able to go back to school, back to college, back to work, out to eat, and maybe even watch a little football. Vanderbilt University did a survey in the middle of May, and it was surprising what they found. Most of the attitudes of people in Tennessee weren't about male versus female, or East versus West, or any other difference. It was about Republican or Democrat. Republicans didn't want to wear a mask very much. Democrats mostly did. Republicans didn't want to, were eager to go out to eat. Democrats were a little slow. Republicans weren't as worried about catching the disease. Democrats were pretty worried. The debate got too politicized. I thank President Trump for what he said yesterday. He's got 70 or 80 million people on his social media follower. If they get the idea that wearing a Make America Great Again mask is good for the country, I'll bet millions will make it. And if they do, the country will be safer, the economy will be better, and we'll be able to go back to school and do the other things that we want to do. So, Mr. President, I ask consent that be placed in the record my opening statement from our hearing yesterday.
Without objection.
I thank Senator Blunt and Senator Murray for their cooperation this month in the series of 6 hearings that we've had on COVID-19. And I think it's very important for the American people to know that while the vaccine is down the road, the tests are coming, the fast tests, and the treatments are coming, and they should be here by the fall. That's what the experts say. It's not what I say. That's what the experts who testified before us say. And the experts all said the following: if you want to contain the disease, if you want to go back to school and back to college and back to work and out to eat and maybe even see a little football, stay 6 feet apart, wash your hands, and wear a mask. Thank the President. I yield the floor.